Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome back to the God Project. My name is Brian, and our co-host Pete, he is currently unavailable. He'll probably be hopping in here in a few minutes, but we wanted to go ahead and get started with our guest today, Kyle Alander from the YouTube channel Christian Idealism. Today he's going to primarily be talking to us about the problem of evil and kind of how he's come to resolve it, and we're going to touch a little bit on his conversion to Catholicism as well. So, Kyle, if you want to briefly tell us about yourself and kind of how you got interested in these subjects.
Yeah, so my name's Kyle Alander. I run the YouTube channel called Christian Idealism. I guess just a backstory. I started the channel, I think, about 4 years ago at this point. It's been 3 years since I started making actual videos, but yeah, I mean, it's been a journey, and I grew up Protestant for most of my life. And there's a sort of time in my life, we can get to that later if you want, but there was sort of a time in my life where I was spiritually, there's a spiritual drought, basically. I had to go to church. I mean, I believed in God, I believed in Christianity, but I don't know, I just didn't really go to church that often until more recently when I converted. Now I go to church go to mass every Sunday. But prior to that, prior to becoming Catholic, I didn't really do much. I just sort of studied philosophy, theology and stuff. And yeah, it's been a journey. But yeah, that's what I do. And of course, for my channel, I mainly focus on, right now I'm focusing primarily on the philosophy of religion. That's sort of my main goal, my main focus right now. And then prior to that, I also focus on the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of science. So those three main fields are mostly what I focus on. Although more recently, I've been focusing more on theology. So my next few videos are going to be on that. But other than that, I've mostly philosophy, religion stuff. So
Nice, very cool.
yeah.
As far as you're not having really gone to church very often, was that due to bad experiences, if you don't mind me asking, or was it just kind of a lack of apologetics or intellectual related subject matter?
Yeah, so it's kind of weird because at least during that time, my family, at least the family that I live with, they don't ever go to church. So I didn't really have that support structure to begin with. Not only that, but at least during, for I think prior to I think before I became a senior in high school, I didn't really have a way to even get to church because my family just never went to church. It wasn't until I got older that I was able to get a car, right? That's when I started college. So I wasn't even I didn't have the transportation to even do it in the first place. That was the first problem. But more importantly, I was prideful, I think. And I'll do a video on this probably in next few days, actually, because it's my channel anniversary is coming up, so I'll reflect on my journey more on that. But basically, I think most of it was pride, personally speaking. And even during that time, even during my spiritual drought, I would call it, I was still studying philosophy, I was still studying apologetics, and I was convinced Christianity were true. But I just didn't have the motivation to actually go and practice the faith. It was all intellectual, 100% intellectual. And I feel unfortunately, I could see that sometimes happen to some people where they treat it like this game, so to speak, like this philosophy game, right? They don't actually. I mean, I don't want to generalize, but I've seen apologists, some apologists that I know have just not gone to church that often. They don't have a spiritual life. It's all just intellectual. Obviously, there are problems with that because God commands us to have a relationship with Him and to actually go to church and stuff like that. But I mean, it took me a while. It wasn't until I became Catholic that I started going every week. But prior to that, it was just I didn't go at all, unfortunately. So
Sure.
yeah.
So was the problem of evil something that made you think maybe Christianity wasn't true? Was that a big reason for or a big area of exploration in your philosophy since you started studying, or was that more recent? How did that
Yeah, so what happened was with the problem of evil, I realized that is the biggest objection to theism. That is like the number one objection. Now, of course, there are other arguments like hiddenness, but I actually think the other arguments are just subsets of like the problem of evil, in the
Sure.
sense that I think that we look at the world. There's imperfections. There's there's divine hiddenness. There's evil, right? So I feel like the problem of evil is like sort of it really
Involved.
is the biggest problem for theism. Like if you really think about it, and not only that, but I think that because it's such a big problem, there's different ways you can cash it out where certain theodicies are not going to be able to answer it fully, right? Like one example is like the free will theodicy. Okay, well, you can present a free will theodicy, but then you're going to have natural evil, you're going to have evolutionary evils. So
Right.
it's like it's like this problem is like much bigger than I think most theists don't really realize how big of a problem this is for theism, because this is like really the corner. And I guess for me in my personal journey, it was sort of questionable, because like one of the things, at least the approach that I took initially was Clay and Jones's approach, which is a more biblical approach. So I would assume Christianity is true, and then I would see, okay, how does the Christian worldview account for this? But I guess the problem I ran into there was the prior probability. So if I'm going to build in Christian theism into my hypothesis, that's going to decrease the prior probability of the hypothesis in question, right? And I think Paul Draper sort of makes this good point as well, where it's like you don't want to build in to your hypothesis in order to explain the data, right? I mean, that's just going to
Right.
decrease. That's just going to decrease, your priors in that case, right? So I had to look elsewhere. One of the first papers that I came across that really changed my perspective on this was it's a paper called the problem. I think it was Many Inscrutable Evils, and it was written by this philosopher named Robert Bass, and he presented this sort of argument from evil. It's an inductive argument from evil, but it basically argues that even if the prior probability of theism is like 99%, you're still going to have a 95% chance probability that God does not exist, given the amount of
Oh,
inscrutable
wow.
evils. I read that paper, and I had to, obviously I was like, okay, obviously the problem of evil is like much bigger than I initially thought, because, if that's, it's big because it's like, does it actually outweigh all the evidence for theism? Like we have all these arguments from fine tuning or consciousness or morality, but then evil comes along. It's like, how much weight does that have? So for
Right.
me, that's when I had to like look elsewhere for an answer. So yeah, I mean, is there any like specific questions you have about like my conclusion on it now, or any of that stuff?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'll have a few. I did want to mention that I've had a similar experience where a lot of the Christians I've interacted with at church and things like that think free will is kind of an all-encompassing explanation for every kind of evil, including animal suffering um,
Yeah.
and natural evil, like you said. Well, and I don't even know if they would say it's an all-encompassing um, answer, but they haven't even considered some of those other ones. Like there's a very large focus on suffering and things like that brought about by humans, which I think is important too. But yeah, an area often neglected is natural evil and suffering. So, what were some of the were there any big examples of evil, like maybe with specific events or people? I can think of a handful that were issues for me. Were there any that stood out to you and made you think like, wow, this is going to be
Yeah.
a big challenge?
So for me, the moral problem of evil was not really an issue. I thought, that at least when I read Clay Jones's work on this, I was convinced by his theodicy initially, at least
Mhm.
when it came to moral evil. And I think his theodicy in some sense works in some capacity. But of course, I think the problem is that his theodicy, I don't think, works with animal suffering, right? The very fact that you have this biological system that is like geared towards like allowing this sort of suffering.
Predation, yeah.
Right. That for me was the biggest. Animal suffering was the biggest thing for me. And I agree with like Cosmic Skeptic, or I think it's Cosmic Skeptic, where he says like animal suffering is like the biggest challenge for Christian theism, and I agree with him. That is like that. The bulk of the evidence against Christian theism is going to be based on that, right? Because it's like, why would God create this system if He could have done it another better way? Like, if there's a better way God could have done this, why did He do it this way rather than, right? So, for me, it became that became the sticking point for me, and so I had to go deep into the literature on the problem of evil specifically, and like the different versions of it and stuff. Because I think another thing I want to mention briefly is like a lot of the responses, at least that I got on the popular level, they were just really bad. So, for example, like the neo-Cartesian idea where animals just don't have any pain, or they don't like have consciousness. It's like just no. Like, there's just so many problems with that view that I just find extremely implausible. Not only that, but like, okay, let's say it is true that, God, or that they don't actually feel pain. Okay, well then why would God create them? Like, if there's no value, like how can you say that they're valuable in any sort of way if they don't have their own consciousness and like have their own, personality and stuff? And that's accepting the neo-Cartesian idea from the start. It's like, okay, well, let's say it is true that they don't experience pain. Well, then why would God create them in the first place? Right? If they don't actually have inner experiences like we do. So yeah, I think regardless, I was not satisfied with a lot of the responses, and I do take the view that most theodicies just don't work. But of course, now I have a theodicy that I think does work, and I think, my conclusion on the problem of evil is that I don't think it works at all, not even in an evidential sense, and I can get into the reasons why if you want me to, but that's my conclusion now. So at this point in my journey, I don't think it works at all, not even in an evidential sense. But I know, there's a lot I could say on that, on why I think that, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll definitely dive into that. One thing I wanted to mention about the neo-Cartesian response, I don't think I knew it was under that label, but I've heard apologists say, I think William Lane Craig says like animals don't have third level awareness or something like that, where they're unlike humans, where we're aware that we are suffering. They might recoil like an amoeba or something, but the mere fact that they're not self-aware is somehow an argument against the severity of animal suffering. And I've thought about that and kind of questioned why it appears that they're genuinely suffering, because if, for instance, our moral intuitions are any sensible guide to an objective moral reality, then why would our intuitions about animals genuinely being in pain and suffering, like if they're on fire or something, why should we distrust those intuitions but then trust moral intuitions? And that's probably not an airtight argument or anything, but that's kind of a thought I've had when considering that issue. So what were some of the compelling responses from the theist side with regards to animal suffering specifically, and then any other area you want to touch on that really made you think, okay, maybe it's not that big a problem?
Yeah, so one of the things is I read there's a few books I read on this. So the first one, of course, was Trent Dowdery's work on his theodicy. Then I read Marilyn McCord Adams on it. Then I read a few papers. So there's one paper by I think it's Daniel Rubio. I can't remember the exact name, but there's a paper about, it's called, I think it's like God Meets Satan's Apple: The Paradox of Creation. I read that paper, and one of the views within the philosophy of religion is that God, or at least that there's classical theism, right? But then more specifically, that classical theism sort of entails that God is not a human moral agent. What does that mean? Well, it means that God is not constrained by ordinary human moral conditions. Now, there is one philosopher, Brian Davies, takes this view. But I don't think his theodicy works, because I think what he wants to say is that God has no moral obligations at all. Whereas I want to say that God has unique moral obligations that only apply to him within a certain axiological context, right?
Okay.
And I feel like the problem of evil sort of assumes an axiology. So in order to actually generate this problem, you're going to have to assume an axiology. So one example is like Robert Bass's paper. He sort of assumed the necessity condition, which says that God, in order to be all good, must minimize suffering, right? Well, that's an axiological condition. That's the necessity condition, where God can only allow suffering that is necessary for a greater good, right? But if God is not a human moral agent, then that's not going to be the condition that God is constrained by, right? And there's a few reasons for this. So the first reason, I think, is when you look at the worlds that God actualizes, right? So you look at all the different worlds that God could have created. Well, if you look at it through what I call a value parts paradigm, where there's always there's more reduced suffering, or there's more good things that could exist in that world, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to be the case. You're going to immediately run into the paradox of creation, because any world that God creates, there can always just be a better one relative to that world, right? So, for example, even let's just say that God created a world where initially everyone is just morally perfect. Okay, that's a good world. Well, then the problem is, well, why did God give us bodies, right? How come God didn't make us super powerful? Well, then that's going to be a better world. And then you could just keep on adding more and more good things to that world to say, okay, well, there's a better world compared to this one, and there's a better world here, and then there's going to come a point where just no world is possible, because any world that God can create, there's always just going to be a better world, right? And there's a few. So the main reason for this is that I would say that God is constrained by the no sphere of choice principle, which means that for any best action God, or any action that God is going to do, there can never be an inferior action. So any action that God does, there can never be an inferior action relative to another action, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But then you run into a problem where any world that God creates, there's always going to be inferior choice. So God can actually create any world, because any world that God creates, he's just always going to necessarily make an inferior choice, right? That's the no inferior choice principle.
Okay.
So then God can't create any world on that paradigm, right? And then this gets, into the problem of what I call value incrementability, which is that for any world that God creates, there's always going to be an incrementable good world, right? That you can't really compare it to, right? So in that sense, if you look at it through a value parts paradigm, God cannot create any world. You're going to immediately run to the paradox of creation, right? And so I would argue that it is just metaphysically impossible for God to create a perfect world in that value parts paradigm. Now, is there a way you can get around this problem? And I would say yes. The way you get around it is to adopt what I call a value whole paradigm. What does this mean? Well, it means that the world is good as a whole, right? So even if there's, even if there's imperfections within that world, those imperfections, those evils are going to be integrated into a larger whole, right? And so that's where you get the value whole paradigm. And then with the value incrementability, principle, you could argue that a perfect, or a world that's viable on the whole, is going to be incrementable, and so you can't really say that there's going to be a better world relative to that, because any other possible world God could create it's just going to be incrementable, right? You can't really compare them, right? And so I would argue that if you adopt this good whole paradigm, the no inferior choice principle, the value incrementability principle, and then you just say that God is motivated to create good things, well, then then I would say that the defeat condition is just entailed from that, which is basically that any imperfections or any evils that happen in any world are going to be integrated into a larger whole, right? And so I guess one clarification what I mean by the defeat condition. So let me see if I can get my notes on this. So the defeat condition says that an evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constituent part of a viable possible whole that not only outweighs the evil, but could not be as valuable as it is without the evil. In that instance, then, the evil remains in the subject, right? So, pain is going to exist in that sort of world. But I would argue, of course, that it is defeated, right? It's integrated into a larger whole, right? And so with this, when you look at it through a value whole paradigm, you immediately get what I would say the defeat condition from this. And so on that sort of account, then any evil that happens, all that God has to do is make sure that it's defeatable, basically. So God is not constrained by the necessity condition. God is not constrained by some other, human moral condition like reducing suffering, right? Because that assumes a value parts paradigm, right? But if you look at it through a value whole paradigm, you're not going to run into that problem, right? And so on that sort of account, then any evil that happens would be just defeatable evil. So, any evil so basically God is permitted to allow any sort of defeatable evils, basically. I hope that makes sense. And that's sort of the axiology that I have on the table now. And I would argue, of course, that when you have this axiology, then no argument from evil is actually successful. You're not going to be able to derive any sort of problems for theism given that sort of axiology.
Okay.
And again, the reason why I mention axiology is because that is literally how the problem of evil gets generated. That is the only way that you can actually present an argument from evil is you have to assume an axiology. That's the starting point. You have to assume it. That's their foundation. And then you can then generate this problem we call the problem of evil. But the problem is if a theist has an axiology that doesn't generate any problems of evil, given what I just mentioned, then then the problem of evil is just not even gonna get off the ground at that point, right?
Okay.
If you have any questions, then
yeah, I'm sure it'll take me a bit to fully process all of that, but one thing that came to mind was I wanted to ask, like, if you think there's any possible way the world could have looked or could look in the future that wouldn't fit in your axiology. I'm not even sure if that question makes sense. Like, is your axiology not based on the way the world looks at all, and it's just kind of a way to question the assumptions of the other axiologies presented that rely on, claiming God would want to eliminate all versions of suffering, or I don't know.
Yeah, so what it does is it sort of lets out the framework for what we consider to be valuable and what we consider to not be valuable, right? So the axiology is sort of like the bedrock of how we look at the data of good and evil, right? How we look at bad states of affairs, right? So in that sense, then it is sort of an undefended assumption that I'm making. But of course, the naturalist has to make the same undefended assumptions anyways, right?
Sure.
And the reason why is because if you look at it through the value parts paradigm, that's an undefended, like looking at it through that's your undefended assumption. Like, why should we look at it this way rather than some other way? And what I'm saying is, okay, we can just do the same thing. Well, we just look at it through a value whole paradigm instead of a value parts paradigm, right? And of course, when you look at it through a value whole paradigm, then you're going to get some interesting consequences from that, which is, of course, one of the consequences is I don't think any problem evil can actually work, right, on that paradigm. Especially, of course, I can get into my theodicy if you want, but yeah, I think once we present a theodicy, once we generate a theodicy from this axiology, then that's it. Then the problem of evil is finished, basically.
So you're saying the value parts paradigm and the value whole paradigm both are equally likely, or both deserve to be taken as seriously as each other, and so there's no reason to prefer the value parts paradigm?
Yeah, so one of the ways I like to look at this is, okay, let's just say that it is true that God was to create a world. Let's just assume a value parts paradigm, and then God is constrained by that paradigm. Okay, then you're immediately going to run into the problem of the paradox of creation. So immediately you're going to run into a metaphysically impossible action, basically. So what I'm saying is either God creates no world, or he creates a world on the good whole paradigm, because that's really the only way that God could create a. Otherwise, you're going to run into the paradox of creation, right? If you look at it through a value parts paradigm. So I actually think the value whole paradigm is sort of like the only metaphysically possible action for God to do, basically. Because again, if theism entails that God is all good, then it also entails that God is going to create good things. But then when we ask the question, okay, which paradigm should we accept on how God creates good things? If we go with the value parts paradigm, that's a metaphysically impossible action to do,
Right.
right? And so then the other option is going to be the value whole paradigm, right? And so that's where I would argue that the only worlds that God could create is worlds that are valuable on the whole, basically.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So do you think, I know you recently came to the conclusion that theism entails Christianity, or maybe it's not that simple.
Well,
but...
I can get into that if you want. I mean, I think in order to get there, we have to understand the theodicy that I have.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I can explain that if you want later. In
Sure,
terms of why I think that. But yeah.
If you think explaining your theodicy would help kind of provide a foundation for that, then sure, go ahead and lay it on us.
Yeah. So one of the things about, I think one of the important things we need to understand in regards to the theodicy is that, and I mentioned this in my episode with on the Adherent Apologetics channel, but briefly, it's the idea that we want to make sure that we have a mapping between God's goodness and a state of affairs, right? So for theism, there is a good mapping from God's nature to a state of affairs, such that a good state of affairs is more likely than a bad state of affairs, right? Given theism, right? And so given a theodicy, then theism imposes some limitations on the upper and lower bounds of the distribution of good and evil, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? And so in order to generate a theodicy, you're going to have to look at it through, you're going to have to make some sort of bare axiological assumptions. But again, this isn't really a problem, because in order to generate the problem of evil, you're going to have to also do the same exact thing. So in order to respond to the problem of evil, you have to do, you're going to have to make some undefended assumptions on this. So I think one of the important things is this undefended assumption that God is motivated by aesthetic qualities. So God is motivated to create a world not necessarily in a moral sense, although that's a part of it, but also that God is motivated to create an aesthetic world, right? And I would argue that given this sort of aesthetic constraint that God has, then God is motivated to create an autonomous creation, right? And I would argue that this autonomous creation is sort of evolves over time through what I call cosmic soul building, and that this is a good thing, right? So this is a good thing for God to do. And also, given the principle of incommensurability, then God actualizes or creates a universe to evolve in its own, and this is an incommensurable good. So you can't really say that there's some other better world for God to create, because again, this is an incommensurable good. And I would argue that this is just a good, right? So if theism entails that there's going to be a good state of affairs, then God will create good things, right? And so if an autonomous world, if cosmic soul building is a good thing, and if there's aesthetic qualities to that, then it's a good thing, and therefore God will do such an action, right? And so from there, I would argue that God has motivations to create an autonomous world like ours, basically a self-governing world. And of course, that this self-governing world would lead to more good things evolving, like humans and animals, right? And then, given the defeat condition, for any pain and suffering that happens to humans and animals, their suffering can be defeated, right, or redeemable, right? So again, given the defeat condition, as long as the evils in that world, as long as the imperfections in that world are defeatable, then God is authorized to allow it, because it's part of a greater whole, right?
Sure.
And then I would argue that all evil is defeatable, of course. And so with the defeat condition, I would also argue that a resurrection is actually entailed. So a physical resurrection is entailed. And the reason for this is that I think that death is a bad thing. And so if death is a bad thing, and if death is an evil thing, then God has to defeat that death, right? And so then that would entail a physical resurrection at the end of time, where all the death and suffering and evil in the world can be sort of put into a, not only can it be defeated, but it also is put into a larger good whole, right? And so then from there, then, Yeah, I mean, you just get a physical resurrection at the end of time from that. That's just entailed from the axiology and, of course, the defeat condition. That's very briefly my theodicy on that. So if you have any questions, any concerns on that, you can ask. I know
Sure.
I very very briefly went over it, but yeah.
So I can see the force behind thinking a general resurrection is entailed if death is evil, and I would agree. Do you think Jesus' resurrection is also entailed, like a specific messianic type figure's resurrection is entailed by that as well, or just a general resurrection?
So I initially sort of I when I formed my theodicy, I obviously came to the conclusion that a physical resurrection at the end of time is entailed from this. Now it gets a little more interesting with the incarnation, because the only question there is, does God have to go into creation to actually defeat that death himself, right? And I would argue, again, this is a fairly new concept that I have, so there might be some other considerations here, but I think that it is either entailed that there's going to be an incarnation, which means that God is going to actually enter into creation, and defeat the death in the world himself, so that the rest of creation can sort of, through his death and resurrection, that the rest of creation can defeat their death, or it's just highly likely that he would do so.
Okay.
So I lean towards the idea that it is actually entailed when we conditionalize the evidence. So what does this mean? Well, when we conditionalize the life of Jesus and we look at human, or at least not just life of Jesus, but I mean, we just look at human history and we ask the question, okay, if God is to become incarnate into a human, who is that person? And I would say Jesus is really the only candidate that fits the bill. There's a few other reasons I have for this. I don't want to get into much details, but I know Swinburne has argued this point as well, where there are certain characteristics of God incarnate that we would expect. And then we look into history. So again, when you conditionalize the evidence, then really the only candidate that fits the bill is Jesus. And then when we take that evidence and then we update our priors, right? And that's, I can get more into that if you want. But basically, when we conditionalize the evidence from human history,
Right.
and then we update our priors, given the theodicy, given the axiology, then literally Christian theism just entails, bare theism entails Christian theism, basically, once we conditionalize the evidence.
Was Swinburne one of the first to use kind of like a Bayesian approach to kind of what you're getting at, like Christianity being from theism?
Yeah, so I think Swinburne, he's the first one to do the Bayesian approach, although prior to this, I mean, there's Aquinas, there's a few other, saints that have made the argument that God would become incarnate, just a priori, God would become incarnate. But of course, I think one of the issues is that I don't think they had, well, first of all, they didn't have the Bayesian framework for this, right? So it would have probably been a little bit more difficult for them to reach this conclusion. But they didn't have at least the knowledge that we have now in terms of cosmic soul building, like aesthetic qualities. And I don't even know if they had the defeat condition in mind at the time, although they might have had some concept of it at the time. At least the way that it's defined now is a little more recent in the philosophy of religion. So, we got to give them a little bit, we got to be a little bit patient with them, because they didn't have the tools that we have to evaluate these sort of things.
Sure.
But yeah, I think Swinburne definitely was on the right track in terms of updating our priors on this. But I think with the theodicy that I have, the axiology that I have, and the theodicy that I have, and the type of theism that I hold to, given I think that classical theism actually just entails that God is going to be a unique moral agent. At this point, I've come to the conclusion that, basically theism just entails Christian theism once we look at it, once we have these sort of tools in mind. So yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Are there other world religions that you think do a particularly bad job at explaining the problem of evil? Like I'm curious who you think is next in line after Christianity, if you've thought about that at all.
I would probably say Hinduism, although I know Hinduism doesn't teach a physical resurrection at the end of time, so that's going to be a problem. But and then of course there's Judaism. So I think that some form of Judaistic Christian theism is going to be true, which basically means some version of the monotheistic or Abrahamic religions is going to be true. So either it's going to
Right.
be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. I think that's just straightforwardly entailed from my theodicy. Um, and then, of course, I think once we conditionalize the evidence, then we can narrow it down even further to Christian theism, given the incarnation and the fact that I think that God would become incarnate. I think that God would enter creation and defeat death, and then through his death and resurrection, we could defeat, death ourselves, right? Through him, right? Um, so I think no matter what, it's definitely going to be narrowed down to the Abrahamic traditions. So it's going to be one of those religions, right?
Sure.
And then I would argue that when we update the priors, then we can even narrow it down further to Christian theism. But again, I just want to be clear here to you and the audience that this is a fairly new idea that I'm working with. So there's still a lot of research I have to do on this, but at this point, I'm fairly confident that that is, that this is the correct way to look at it through. So, yeah.
No, thanks. That was a good explanation. You mentioned that animal suffering was the largest problem as it pertains to the problem of evil for you. Were there any issues within human suffering and human evil that you thought counted as evidence potentially against theism, or did you think free will kind of accounted for all of that?
I don't think free will. I think it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So I actually think a soul building theodicy is gonna be
Okay.
required for at least for human suffering. And then for animal suffering, I think that all you really have to do is just point out that every instance of suffering is defeatable, so God is authorized to allow it, right? And so
Mhm.
with that, it's just the problem evil is not going to have any sort of evidential weight. And then, of course, I think once we present a theodicy, then I think that's where we could actually turn the tables essentially and show that theism is a better explanation of evil than naturalism in many respects. So, um, so yeah.
Sure. Um, so now, what are in your opinion, what are the best objections to Christianity or the best arguments for atheism now that the problem of evil doesn't really serve that much of an issue for you?
So, in terms of atheism, I mean, I'd probably go with Quentin Smith's arguments from cosmology. And then there's a few other considerations in regards to how exactly does does the explanatory power of theism work in relation to naturalism, right? So I still hear this objection that oh well, God could have done it some other way, so therefore it's not evidence against theism, or it's not evidence for theism or something, right? But I think those arguments just don't work once we look at it through. Well, I think once we look at it through a value hole paradigm, I don't think it works. But I also think that once we update the prior, so once we understand that Bayesian inference is a subset of learning theory, and the fact that we can update our priors given the evidence, then I just don't think any of those sort of arguments have any sort of weight. So I would have to go, at least for atheism, I would have to go with like Quentin Smith's sort of stuff on this, his sort of arguments, because I'm just not convinced of the problem of evil. I'm not convinced of divine hiddenness. Any sort of argument from scale is not going to work, especially with my theodicy. So like a lot of the evidence against theism in my mind is just out the window from the start. And that's why I'm pretty much convinced now that I'm like 99% convinced that theism is true. At least bare theism. And then now for Christian theism, it gets a little more complicated. I think the best objections against that are still going to be like historical objections. So like the unreliability of the gospels, or like certain arguments against the resurrection, or I think those still have a lot of weight in my mind, at least. So yeah, if I had to refer to like the best arguments against Christian theism, it would probably be in the more the historical side of things and not necessarily philosophical.
Sure.
But maybe it's just because I haven't studied the history as much. So maybe if I get into that, like I won't find those convincing either. I mean, I've already read a few books or I've read a lot of books on New Testament scholarship, and like I got to be honest, I think that most New Testament scholarship just has bad methodology. So maybe it's just I don't quite like see where the problems of those arguments are. But I mean, for now, I still have them in my mind. So like they still bring doubt at times, but it's not like instrumental where like I start questioning like all my beliefs or something. So
Sure.
yeah.
Just to clarify, when you said the argument from scale, is that basically when atheists say humans compared to like the backdrop of this immense universe are so small that that counts as evidence against theism?
Yeah, and I think the problem there is it's assuming that we are the only good things that God would create. So obviously I think that God would create humans given that we're uniquely good things. But I think it ignores the fact that like, stars and planets are also good things, right? In an
Right.
aesthetic sense. So it's like, why would God not create those? Like it doesn't really make any sense to me. Like it seems like in order for like this argument from scale to like get off the ground, you're gonna have to make some like really bad axiological assumptions that I don't think the theist is going to grant. So yeah.
Yeah, I really liked what Luke Barnes said about the argument from scale. It was he basically said, what size universe does naturalism predict? It doesn't predict a universe of any particular size, so it fares no better than theism, basically.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting. Like neither hypothesis makes a prediction about what size the universe should be. Um, so now, if you want, we can, unless you have more on the problem of evil you'd like to talk about. I'm interested in hearing about some of the reasons you recently converted to Catholicism. So what prompted that? Like what prompted even the investigation?
So what prompted the investigation was I saw a lot of people online arguing about Protestant versus Catholic theology, and I realized a lot of my objections to Catholicism just did not work. They're either straw man or just misunderstandings, or it's just flat out wrong, right? Just wrong view of things. And so I had to question, I had to look into Catholic theology itself and see, okay, what are they actually teaching? Because like I can't get my information from evangelicals because they're just gonna lie to me, right? Like when you actually like look into it, it's like they just completely misrepresent the Catholic stuff. So I have to like look into like what actual Catholics themselves are saying on this. So that's when I picked up a few books. I know I picked up Trent Horn's book on the case for Catholicism. That really changed a lot of my views on Catholic theology. And then just I think one of the biggest things for me was the Eucharist was the biggest one for me, but also like this idea of justification, like how salvation works. I realized a lot of the objections that Catholics receive from Protestants are just complete straw man arguments, right? So this whole idea that Catholic theology is like works based salvation. It's like, yeah, you got to really like it's just completely just wrong inferences. And I actually think that when you like, for example, when you look at Paul, so in Romans talk about like faith and stuff versus James works, right? I think the best way to actually reconcile those ideas is just going to be a sort of Catholic view of things, right? Where you initially get you're initially through faith we do works. So works is a sort of, it's not the cause of salvation, it's the effect of salvation.
Right.
That's that's the Catholic view, right? That's how you reconcile the views. It's not that works gets you to salvation, not that works get you to heaven, but rather Jesus Christ sort of gave you, sanctifying grace, and through that sanctifying grace, you can do good works, right? So works is sort of the effect, not the cause of salvation, right? And once I
Now, that's
understood
not
that, I
unique.
mean, yeah,
Sorry, that's not unique to Catholicism, right? Like, aren't there other Protestant denominations that adhere to that kind of view between faith and
yeah,
works?
And then I guess one of the other things is the only way around that sort of view is to take a Calvinist view, right? Where there's predestination, but of course I think Calvinism, there's a lot of problems scripturally with Calvinism, but I don't know. I think Calvinism is necessarily false for different moral reasons I have for it. I don't want to get too much here, but because I wasn't convinced of like a lot of the Calvinist arguments, I had to accept the Catholic view of justification at that point. And then when I got into things like sola scriptura, sola fide, I got into things like infant baptism. Then that's when I realized that Protestant theology, at least how it's practiced in America, is just wrong, flat out wrong. It just does not fit with how the early church would have viewed things. And I actually think that like a lot of, if you're going to be a consistent Protestant, I'm convinced now that the early church would have not recognized Protestants, at least today, like as Christians, given a lot of the views that they hold to. So yeah, I came to a point where I had to abandon Protestant theology, and I was sort of like a mere Christian theist. I was sort of looking into, the Catholic versus Orthodox debate, and then I guess what got it for me was, of course, the papacy, right? So, I looked into many arguments for the papacy, and particularly is the typological argument for me is what really pushed me towards Catholic theology, or Catholicism specifically. And just the fact that, like, when you look into like the Great Schism, for example, there's this myth that like, oh, well, the Orthodox Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church is united in every respect. They're not really united. I mean, if you really look into it, they have their own differences and stuff. They don't really have a unified sort of, church, right, in the same way that Catholics would, right? And so I just became Catholic because I thought the bulk of the evidence just favored the Catholic side better than the Orthodox side, and of course the Protestant side. So yeah, I just eventually, I think one day, I think what happened was one day it was like back in July, I believe, of last year. And because I was thinking about, joining RCIA at my church, at the local Catholic church that I now go to, but at the time I wasn't going to it. So I was like really thinking about it. Like, should I just convert? Like, just decide, I'm done. And that's what I did. So, yeah, it was a journey. But I was able to get through it, and I became Catholic. And I honestly, that was the best decision I could have made, because I think if I would have chosen to stay Protestant, I'm not sure where I would be today. I would probably still not be going to church or anything. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm sure you were having conversations with Protestant friends during this period prior to your formal conversion. Like, what were some of the best objections to Catholicism that you were like, well, yeah, maybe I should rethink this, or were there any that posed any significant challenges?
So the best objections were the arguments against the papacy. So there's a few of them. So I guess the biggest one for me is going to be the Vatican I thing, where it's like, okay, well, the early church, they didn't have this idea of at least infallibility as the Catholic Church would define it today. Most of church history did not have this doctrine of, papal infallibility and papal supremacy, right? And so for me, that was the biggest thing for me. And in my mind, I mean, even to this day, I still have like some weight. Like, that objection still has some weight, that holds. But I think that overall, I think the typological evidence from the scriptures, and then of course with the verse from Matthew and stuff, I think that just outweighs it. Because I mean, it just seems kind of weird to me. Like, if you're really going to make that argument consistently, I mean, the early church didn't have like a 66 book canon for the scriptures, right? It's like, if you're going to make this argument, well, then Protestant theology is definitely false, right? like if you're going to apply the same exact standards and apply it to Protestant theology, it's just not going to, like, Protestantism is definitely false. And then, same thing with, although the Orthodox might have some sort of advantage here in terms of, like, but I think a lot of the problems for Eastern Orthodox is I think that they have, well, I think they have a wrong view of original sin. And then, of course, I think that they're wrong about the Filioque. So there's a few considerations there. But yeah, I think that overall, when you compare Catholic to Orthodox, I think the Catholic has the advantage in terms of evidence for the papacy and stuff. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, you're giving me a lot of things to look into, so I'm excited. This is unrelated, but I wanted to ask you about your recent devil's advocate debate and see if you saw a lot of value in that, and then ask also like how you think people that aren't necessarily going to be participating in formal debates on YouTube could apply some of those principles of learning to defend the other side's position.
Yeah, so that was a very interesting debate because I had to play devil's advocate. I had to argue against the position that I don't hold to. So, it was challenging because, I think that some of those arguments have some sort of weight, at least with the lack of explanatory power for theism. That still, like, has some sort of weight, although I have a response to it. But, I'm not, like, totally satisfied with like my response to, like, that sort of objection. And then, the fact that that naturalism, like, seems to have this sort of advantage in terms of, like, we just don't see, like, as much divine intervention as we would initially expect, right? So it seems like a lot of things are at first, epistemically more friendly towards naturalism, right? Which is why I have, basically what I'm saying is I think that naturalists could be rational in their belief in naturalism, right? So I think that atheist naturalists, they can rationally hold to that worldview if they want to. Of course, I don't think the arguments work, right? But I think that they could, like, a rational person could be a naturalist. It's not like an irrational position, right? And I think that's sort of the whole point I was trying to point out there, which is like, you could hold to naturalism, you could be an atheist rationally, right? There are, I would say, good reasons, or at least, good considerations to be an atheist, right? So yeah, that was really the only point of that, which was like, I just want people to realize, like, hey, like, I understand where you're coming from, why you hold the position you do. So yeah.
Yeah, I haven't finished it yet, but I've enjoyed what I've heard so far. And Emerson mentioned some arguments for theism in his intro that I hadn't heard before. So
yeah, me neither.
yeah, it was
So,
interesting. Well, I think that's it for my questions for now. Did you have anything for me or anything else you wanted to touch on?
I know you used to be I think, didn't you do an interview with
Rebecca on Bread of
Rebecca?
Life. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you were a Christian, and then you were agnostic, and then now you're a theist, but then you're like a weird.
Yeah,
What's your view?
that was kind of a semi joke. I mean, I think I said I'm a weird flavor of theism because I'm not mainstream, bro. But so I wouldn't say I'm a deist. Like initially, I thought that's what I would best be described as, and then people were Blake Junta from Belief Map was like, well, a deist strictly thinks that God is not involved, and your position on God's involvement is more of agnosticism. And I was like, okay, sure. So I think he said that's philosophical theism or bare theism. I've heard it called different things, but that's kind of my position. Although nowadays I find myself leaning more towards an interventionist type God because I do find certain miracle claims pretty compelling. Like I watched Elijah Stevens' documentary Send Proof, and there were multiple cases in there that I think are virtually impossible to explain unless they're hoaxes by just appealing to natural mechanisms.
I haven't
So
looked into what exactly, what's the context of those miracles. I'm just wondering.
it was all miracle healings. So there was a woman who had been blind for, I want to say 12 to 15 years. And then her eyesight came back like instantly after her husband had prayed. And of course, people had prayed for her before, but
are these religious neutral ones, or are they more Christian Muslim
these
type?
these were primarily, well, I think these were exclusively Christian miracle claims in the documentary. I haven't actually explored a ton of miracle claims in Muslim contexts or other religious contexts. I didn't. Have you? Or
well, yeah, because there are a few. So like I know Buddhist. There are a few like Buddhist, although it's a little more complicated because most of them are like, I know there's this one guy, and I forgot the exact name, but there's this guy in Africa that was like a miracle worker. But then like when you asked him like what's your beliefs, he said he was doing this in the name of Jesus. So I'm like, okay, well, like, all right, well, because like sometimes there's a new argument for the resurrection that a friend of mine, Caleb, I think it's Caleb Jackson, has, which is that if Jesus is still alive, then we would expect miracles in his name to still be performed even to this day. And so in order to like explain all those miracles on a non-resurrection hypothesis is just really, really difficult. So for me, like that sort of argument like is just like I can't like at that point it's like either Christian theism is true, or like just hundreds of people are just like deluding themselves into believing these sort of things. Like it's like, even as I try to play devil's advocate to like, okay, is there a way you could explain this away? I mean, yeah, but then it's like really ad hoc to do, like it's extremely ad hoc to explain like some of these miracles away. So for me, that's where being a Christian theist like really pushes it for me. So and especially now that like with my theodicy, like my theodicy, because I think it entails some sort of bare theism, like that means like the probability of Christian theism, if it's equal to bare theism, then like these miracle claims just add more evidence basically for me. So I mean that's why it's yeah.
yeah, no, I mean I think they add a tremendous amount of weight to the case.
Yeah.
So I'm eager to look into them more and to do as you said and try and play devil's advocate and kind of poke holes where I can. But I think that's going to be, it's obviously impossible to evaluate all of them to that extent. But
right.
I mean, you could probably say that the fact that there's such a high number also adds credibility to it.
Right.
So I'm excited to see where that investigation takes me. And we'll definitely, I think we're having Caleb on in a couple of weeks to talk about his new book and his research into miracles. So stay tuned. Yeah,
it's a new argument. So and I don't know how like that's I think it's an irrefutable argument in the sense that like in order to like explain away these miracles, your hypothesis is just going to be extremely ad hoc at that point. So
yeah, and I've heard crazy examples, like hyperbolic examples, where I think it was in Mike Lacona's debate with Matt Dillahunty, where he said, if a person were decapitated and people prayed to Jesus for them to be healed and they were healed, like, wouldn't that count as evidence? And I don't want to put words in Matt's mouth. I could be wrong on this, but I want to say he still said no, that wouldn't count as evidence in favor of Christian theism. And it's like, I could grant that there's some unknown
natural
way, but like what's more plausible, right? Like if we're not completely ruling out Christian theism at the outset, it seems like, of course, that would be the better explanation for why that took place. Anyway, so
too bad Pete didn't join us.
Yeah, hopefully he got whatever he needed to get done. But I appreciate you just speaking with me and agreeing to kind of do this somewhat last minute. So if I know your YouTube channel is Christian Idealism, is there any other places where people can find you?
I mean, yeah, on Twitter. You'll find me on Twitter as well. Just same thing, Christian Idealism. So
Cool. Well, thanks again, man. And hopefully we can do something similar in the future.
No problem.
All right. Take care.